This time on Poll Hub, how time has flown. We're celebrating our 400th episode, and so naturally, it's extra special. This time around, our student producers came up with a trivia night theme. They claim it's going to be fun. I have to confess, I'm a little bit worried about looking dumb. We will see what happens. Plus, we're bringing back some voices from the past. Many of the students who made Poll Hub what it is today have moved on to great careers. We're going to hear from them. And finally, the fun fact, it's going to take us back to the 1980s, everybody's favorite decade. Or not. Stick around, we've got a lot to get to. Hey, remember that one? That was our original intro music back in the summer of 2017 when episode 1 first appeared in whatever your podcasting app of choice was at the time. Anyway, welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho. I'm Mary Griffith.
I'm Hunter Petro.
I'm Neil Viswanathan.
I'm AJ Gambino.
And I am still Lee Marengoff.
Well, each of our student producers, Hunter, Neil, and AJ, came up with one topic that has a lot of salience right now and has a long history as an issue that Americans have cared about.
We'll introduce each topic, try to guess how Americans felt at the time, and then see how those views have shifted over the years, with plenty of thoughtful discussion about why those shifts may have happened.
And you can guarantee we'll probably be keeping score on the responses.
Not just probably, Lee. We are keeping score. So first, for each of their segments, our student producers will be the ones that are asking the trivia questions. But to kick things off, I think it may be good for us to try a few and see how it goes, which is a pat phrase that we know very well here at the Marist Poll. This question comes from a Research and Forecasts Ethan Allen survey. In 1985, what percentage of Americans do you think said that marriages between members of the same sex should be legalized? 1985. What are your guesses for the percentage of Americans who thought that?
I'll guess third, because that way I can sort of hedge my bets with where they're
He's already
guessing.
strategizing. Okay, somebody jump in.
Okay, and you know what? I will guess a third.
33%.
33%.
I'm going to go a little higher, Barb, and go with 38%.
Well, see, now if I was a gambler, I would just say 32% and take the over and under on that. However,
This is not The Price is Right, Lee.
Although it could be. What's the prize if we win?
We'll discuss that at the end.
I am going to say 8%. 8.
So Lee is just under, but definitely the closest. He's going to get a point here. The answer is 11%. 11%
Wow.
in 1985.
I was going to say 12.
Interesting.
Okay, well, you came close.
Interesting.
11% either agreed strongly or somewhat that same-sex marriage should be legalized. So, Lee, you a little spoiler alert, you actually teed up the next question, which is the follow-up to this. So what about now? This one comes from Gallup. And just last year, 2024, they asked, do you approve of same-sex marriage? So what percentage of Americans in 2024 approved of legal same-sex marriage? Lee, why don't you go first this time?
72%.
Others?
I will say 78.
I'm going with 70.
Mary gets a point. Mary gets a point. The answer is 69%, up a whopping 58 percentage points over roughly 40 years. It is one of the most incredible, fast changes in public opinion on a big social issue in American history. So,
Do I get an award for being off by the most consistent difference?
no, you don't. So there's 1 point for Mary, 1 point for Lee. Let's do one more, and then we can get to this. So, women getting paid the same as men. What year, there's a little twist, what year do you think Gallup first asked a question about that?
Well, I'm going to say 1955.
Okay.
You're wrong.
Yeah, so what do you think it is, Lee?
I'll let Mary go.
I'm going to go with 1974.
Okay, because Mary was mean to me on the last one, I'm going to box her out, and I'm going to say, you said 74. I'm going to say 1973.
Barb gets the point. 1948. In 1948,
Wow.
Gallup first asked that question, coming out of the war, I'm guessing.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly what I thought of, was World War II, when women had been in a lot of positions in manufacturing and all sorts of businesses, and the men came marching home.
So here's the follow-up to that one. What percentage
Hold
of...
on a second. We're right now 1-1-1 on the responses. Each of us has got one correct.
Not that you're competitive or anything, Lee.
You.
So here's the follow-up. What percentage of Americans in 1948 said women should get the same pay for the same work as men?
Mary, you haven't gone first, I don't think.
Wow, these are good questions.
15%.
15. Lee, you have to go second. You can't keep playing this game.
What percentage thought it should get? I'm going to go with this is not easy. I'm going to go with 22%.
Okay. Barb?
And I'll go with 11.
This stunned me when I found this. The answer was 77%
Whoa!
in 1948. And
Whoa.
so who was closest there? Now I can't remember the numbers
I don't think anybody gets a point on
because
this
you were so
one.
far off.
If
yeah.
you're not, because I mean, this was clearly
So it's still one-
overwhelming consensus.
So it's still 1-1-1.
And,
I think that's fair. It's worth noting that the most recent survey on this issue we could find was in 2017. University of Michigan asked this question, and it asked a slightly different question, I should say. It asked Americans if they thought employers should be required to pay the same work for both genders, which is a slightly different question. It's the closest analog we could find. The old question just isn't asked anymore. 87% of Americans agreed. So from 1948 to now, from 77% to 87%, the vast majority of Americans have thought the same thing for all of these years, and yet,
and
yet.
yes,
Okay.
and yes.
So I think you get the gist. That's how it's going to go. So let's get to it.
Since we started off with a question rooted in social justice, let's stick with the theme of human rights. Specifically, how Supreme Court decisions on these issues have often been ahead of public opinion. We wondered how that turned out. We're looking at two landmark cases where the court issued rulings that were far more progressive than public sentiment at the time, but as the years passed, these decisions led to very different outcomes in how society ultimately responded and adapted. We're looking at Brown v. Board of Education and Loving v. Virginia. So first, we're going to start off with a question about Brown, from a survey released just after the decision. In 1954, what percentage of Americans do you think supported the idea that children, no matter their race, should be allowed to attend the same schools?
Lee, you've been weighing in on this. Go ahead, you start us off.
I would say 31%.
31%?
I'll go 23%.
I'll go 38%.
The answer is 55%.
Yeah, we certainly do underestimate.
Well, that's why we do
some of
surveys,
these
because
incidents.
we're obviously lousy guessers.
Oh, you mean so when people start claiming that we've made up our data? Clearly, we have not.
We don't. That's correct.
So, Lee, you were the closest? I believe?
I'm
Okay.
No,
sure.
Barb.
No,
Barb was the
Oh,
closest.
Barb
No, I was the
Okay.
I was the
So
closest.
Barb's got her second point.
It's not necessarily surprising that the nation was split at the time. Let's compare this to today with a statistic from Ipsos. What percentage of Americans in 2024 do you believe supported the outcome of Brown?
Well, I will jump in and say 72%.
72.
Mary, you go next.
I keep
I'm
getting
having-
stuck in the middle. I'm not a real big fan of this. I'm gonna go with 81%.
The trick question would be to go lower than 55, but I will go with 62.
The answer is 86%.
Mary.
So,
All right,
Mary, you're the
Mary.
closest.
Mary, that was almost nailing it. Good job.
You're not liking this game.
So
Can we play
what's-
another game?
Wait, Lee, what's the score again? 2-2, what?
Well, I
Oh,
think
don't.
I
Oh,
check-
Mary, don't get his competitive juices going.
I believe it's
Oh,
2-2. I believe it's 2-2 because Jay put a new rule about you have to be within a certain range on the responses, and I thought that was making it up after the fact. So I thought that one was rigged.
While many would be led to believe that we've seen linear progress regarding educational segregation, this big majority does not tell the entire story. According to the National Education Organization, schools are more segregated today than in the late 60s. So why didn't this overwhelming public support turn into continued progress?
You know, at first glance, that does seem like a huge contradiction. After all, Brown was a legal milestone, and majority support, was there at the time. But what it took to carry out the court's order was decidedly less popular. Desegregation, which in the North especially meant busing, and that was met with fierce resistance nationwide.
Yeah, initially, Lee, there were big gains. Black student enrollment in desegregated schools jumped dramatically. It increased from 1 to 40% in just 6 years immediately following the decision. And initially, federal intervention rapidly sped up desegregation. Everyone's seen those iconic pictures of Ruby Bridges and the Little Rock Nine, but political backlash slowed this initial momentum.
Richard Nixon Supreme Court appointees Lewis Powell and William Rehnquist pushed back on desegregation remedies in cases such as Milliken v. Bradley, which limited cross-district busing in Detroit, and Justice Berger wrote for the majority, "No single tradition in public education is more deeply rooted than local control over the operation of schools." Legal experts argue that the court's rollback helped accelerate an urban-suburban split in education that still exists to this day.
Yeah, so nothing was final at that point, and then Ronald Reagan initially had cut federal funding for the 1972 Emergency School Act, which had provided federal funds to help local school districts implement desegregation, including things like teacher training and student transportation and community engagement. And this represented, for the nation, a formal retreat, really, from enforcing and supporting school desegregation efforts directly through policy and through funding.
And the National Education Organization also notes that kind of more generally, discriminatory policies such as redlining and restrictive covenant laws, which are more around real estate, but they have big impacts on schools. These are reflected in schools across the country because of how school districts and real estate, neighborhoods operate. Even though the court's ruling on Brown was hugely significant, it was a huge turning point in the civil rights movement. Fixing the problem of endemic school segregation was a far more complex riddle, and it has yet to be solved.
So while Brown is an example of the court aligning with public opinion, but failing to successfully resolve the issue, the 1967 historic Loving v. Virginia ruling shows us an entirely different narrative. So now, back to the trivia. What year did the majority of Americans support legal interracial marriage for the first time?
All right, I'll go first because I've been accused of playing strategically in my selection. What year was the first year that it was supported? I will say 1975. They were thinking on my clock too.
19, yeah, I know this is tough. I'll say 1980.
Barb, I was thinking the same, but I'm not going to box you out. I'm going to go with 1977.
The answer might shock you. It wasn't until 1997 that most Americans supported marriage between people of different races.
Wow.
So who gets the point?
Interesting.
Who gets the point?
No, I think this
I think it was
is
you, Barb.
No, I think that I think this is a shutout because I think we should at least get the right decade in order to get a point.
I mean, if it applied to me,
and I think similarly to our guests on same-sex marriage, I think that the perception of history is obviously very different at times than the reality. And so I will not take a point for this because I would not think it was late. I would not have thought it was late 90s.
Well, off tape, she will definitely say, I was just kidding and I get the point.
We'll give you the point.
I think we should have a new scoring system.
Well, this number, like support for Brown, has steadily increased. It also accurately predicted social change in ways Brown did not.
So the last time Gallup asked this question was in 2021. 94% of Americans supported interracial marriage. But it's kind of remarkable how long the journey has really taken us, how long it's been. At the time of the ruling, under 20%, fewer than 20% of Americans supported marriage between whites and non-whites, as it was asked at that point. So it took 30 years for a majority of Americans to get behind the court's decision and another 20 years to cross the 90% mark.
I mean, that's incredible. It is one of those things that you teach in class and kids probably are like, I can't believe that. In this case, it's what's so interesting about this is that in this case, the court's decision did affect social change. According to Pew, in 2015, 17% of newlyweds were in interracial marriages. That was up from just 3% at the time of Loving. And according to the census, in 2022, about 19% of married couples were interracial. That was up nearly 3 times from 2008. So that's a pretty short window there where only 5% were. And what about unmarried couples? So we talked about, interracial marriage, but in unmarried couples, interracial unmarried couples jumped from 12% in 2008 to nearly 29% in 2022. So I think it begs the question, why is this outcome so different from Brown?
Well, for starters, marriage is deeply personal, and when rulings affect individual freedoms, people appear to adjust faster when they see it in their lives. The rate of acceptance for interracial marriage was likely sped up by the unavoidability of the issue for many families. For instance, Pew found that 63% of non-Black Americans in 1990 said that they would be uncomfortable with a family member marrying a Black person. By 2016, this number dropped to only 14%. And media and pop culture have played a vital role. According to the Journal of Applied Social Psychology in 2013, exposure to media portrayals of Black-white interracial relationships was associated with more positive attitudes towards such relationships.
So unlike school desegregation, which requires a big societal structural change and broad public buy-in to the change, acceptance of interracial marriage only requires individuals change their hearts and minds. And that can still be really hard. But when someone in your family is involved, it may make it a little bit easier to go down that road.
So, let's take a step back. While in both Brown and Loving, the courts were ahead of their times, Loving seems to have succeeded in changing both law and culture, while Brown did not do the same. Why do you think that some Supreme Court rulings have a greater impact in practice than others?
I think it has to do with the times and how dramatic the changes are. And then, courts go through phases. And like right now, we have a majority conservative court. And it's a result of, in large part, Donald Trump's selection of a lot of justices. So in a sense, the court decisions are going to be much more compatible generally with what the president's social policy directions are. Obviously, there's legalities in the court's role that are different now. So I think when you talk about these two cases, we have to look at the time, look at the society, where we were, and then, what happens is almost like a social mid-course correction. And so in Brown versus Board of Education, we end up having the court sort of overstepping where public opinion was at the time. And then, famously, we get into the civil rights movement of the 60s, and we find that when Martin Luther King went north and found racial segregation just as strong in Chicago as he did elsewhere, and the busing was opposed so much in places like Boston and Chicago, northern cities, not the deep South. There's a lot of lessons in that for just the relationship of the court, because they are lifetime appointees over time in the society, that what's going on in society when they go in a new dramatic direction.
That point about it being personal versus societal seems to strike home, because there's another example of something that was very unpopular at the time of the Supreme Court ruling and became very popular very quickly, which is same-sex marriage. This is all within the last decade and a half, and that is much faster speed than Loving versus Virginia. But in both cases, I think some social scientists have argued when you know somebody, there's somebody in your family or somebody in in your friends group that somebody, it's a lot harder to discriminate against them or what they need or want from society. Whereas desegregation of schools, like you pointed out, Martin Luther King came north and said, look, all you Northerners can blame the South for being a racist cesspool, but look in your own backyard. That is so hard, I think, for people to deal with, because it's not a personal thing. It's, we're all to blame.
Yeah, I can speak more personally a little bit about that, because my parents are both of different ethnicities, and when they first got married at this point about 25 years ago, like both sides of the family, not that it was discrimination, I would say in any way, but there were obviously a lot of ignorant comments and a lot of misunderstandings. And both my sides of the family consider themselves pretty progressive, I think. But even then, there were still these comments, and they didn't really become resolved until my parents got married, and then me and my sister were born, and then it became very personal for everyone. So I think I've definitely seen that in practice.
Was that cultural, though? Because one side of your family is Indian and the other is Vietnamese, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so is that there is the cultural thing in some cultures where marrying outside of your faith, for instance, in some cases, or marrying outside of your ethnic group beyond just black and white, like we were talking about in Loving versus Virginia, that's just historically and culturally, you just don't do that. Was that part of what was going on?
I think that's part of it, but then I think I've also seen it on both sides of my family. So my mom's side of the family, well, my mom was born in Vietnam. They had lived in America since my mom and her aunts were all, before they were even able to speak, pretty much. So they kind of grew up with that in a melting pot. And even then, it was still a little, not shocking, but it just took a little while to get adjusted to.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And if you think about when areas were segregated by different ethnic groups, not just racial groups, but religious and ethnic groups, you sort of married in your own group, and that was going to be more accepted, on the face of it than an Italian marrying an Irish or a Jewish person marrying a Catholic. And that's not even as extreme as the racial differences. But, we're a much more interconnected society, at least to a point. I mean, obviously there's disagreement as to how much that is, but there's so many very common things in the old guard. I know in the Jewish faith, people are wondering just how long can we have the assimilation, Jews marrying non-Jews, and that becomes an issue for that particular ethnic group. And getting back to the busing on the same-sex marriage, I mean, you're right. With the same-sex marriage, I mean, that changed probably most dramatically of any social movement in terms of public opinion that I can think of. I mean, that just took off. And it was obviously slow in coming, but when it got to that point, then sort of tipped the threshold, and then there was this wider acceptance. And I think, if I think of busing, I just think of the anger that was there and the threat people felt that somehow their life was being challenged, and this was now the beginnings of
kids.
The end. Yeah.
And it's their kids. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it had so if you had the images in your mind, you were talking, Jay and Neil, you have images in your mind of what those school busing things were and all the whole integration movement in the 50s and the 60s, that's famous visuals. Same-sex marriage doesn't have those. So it's a different level of closeness and proximity. And I think that's a big difference.
Right. And interracial marriage doesn't have that either. I wonder if maybe this comes down to simply the remedy. So it's not so much about what the court ruled, it's about the remedy. The remedy in Loving versus Virginia was, you got to let people get married. I mean, that's not a sledgehammer. The remedies that came out of Brown v. Board of Education were, we're going to change the nature of your schools in some communities by putting your kids on buses and sending them to other schools all the way across town. That is just a fundamentally different remedy. And it is a sledgehammer. I mean, to some people, it was a sledgehammer. I will note that there was significant Black opposition to desegregation in the way it rolled out, in that many of the Black schools in the South who had Black professionals teaching, obviously, in them, were shut down, and those teachers lost jobs. And so there's been a lot of, not revision, but a lot of looking back on that. A lot of historians have been looking back at that period and saying that the remedy maybe was not the right remedy to fix the problem, when the problem is rooted in patterns of settlement that were racist to their core, redlining and all this, and that how you fix that, I mean, that might not be any easier, but the remedy was the wrong remedy for the problem that was needed to be addressed.
And I think you're identifying underlying racism that existed. We had an urbanization of America, then we had a suburbanization of America, and there were schools built in suburbia for the purpose of providing schools for what was more the dominant white population. And you don't have to go far in Poughkeepsie, New York, right where Marist is, that the city is now largely people of color, and the schools around the city are the suburban schools. I lived right on the border between the town and city of Poughkeepsie. So the nearest schools to me were the city of Poughkeepsie schools. But because I lived in the town of Poughkeepsie, technically I was bused 8 miles each way to go to school, because that was where the white school was, because that was the jurisdiction I lived in. So technically I was bused to protect the segregation. And so it's an oddity, but a reality of how things have developed and how much better we are today. In some ways, a lot better. In other ways, we still got a long and maybe even a longer way to go than we had at some other times.
Now, before we get to the next trivia segment, we did want to do something we promised here, which is to hear from some of the students who have made Poll Hub possible over these 400 episodes. So we reached out to a bunch of alums to find out what their favorite memories were, what Poll Hub meant to them. maybe some of their traumatic experiences. Just kidding. Here are a few.
I'm here with Marcello Bettman today, who is a former student producer and editor on Poll Hub, one of the very first, actually, who is currently working for the All In podcast.
It's great to be back. I can say hugely, honestly, my experience at the poll probably helped more than my degree because I currently work for a podcast doing very similar things actually, which is hilarious. I did a little bit of social media in between, but honestly, the skills of working in the production world, even though podcasts are fairly streamlined in the sense that you do your show notes and it's pre-recorded and you have a bunch of time to edit and you can kind of adapt it how you want to. But yeah, learning how to master audio and turn some of those as well. What I did at the poll was find some clips, turn them into snippets. Usually it was text snippets for Twitter and stuff like that and Instagram. But yeah, it was great. It was fantastic. I was able to apply it. I do all that and more today. So it's very applicable.
We're here with Amelia Morel, who is one of the first, if not the first student to work on the Poll Hub podcast. Do you have a single favorite Poll Hub memory?
I just enjoyed, taping each week with Mary and Lee and Jay and Barb. It was always fun to catch up with them, especially because it was during the pandemic, so everything was on Zoom. It was a nice interaction during the week to just catch up with them. And I got a dog during the pandemic, and everybody was really into my dog Hudson and how he was named after the Hudson River where Marist is. And so everybody would always want a Hudson update, so I would always show him on Zoom.
All right, let's get back to the trivia. So this time we're setting the time machine to the late 60s, and Gallup has been polling Americans on their opinions about marijuana legalization since the summer of Woodstock back in 1969. When Gallup first asked if marijuana should be legal, support was pretty low. How low do you think it was?
And what year?
1969.
They asked this in 1969.
Yes.
And it was really low.
Yes, that's your hint.
We got a spoiler alert
Is
this
it
time.
population in my dorm in college, or is this a national audience?
I wasn't born yet, so that's a little hard for me.
You weren't born for the Brown v. Board of Education question either, and I wasn't either, so come on.
So how low was it? Okay, I'll say 8%.
Wow.
Mary?
Okay, I'm gonna go. Mary, you go.
I shouldn't have done that to Mary Lee. Actually, you should be in the middle.
Okay, well then I was ready to go. I will say 14%.
Yeah, see, I was going to go around 8 with Barb. I'm going to go with 6%.
Okay, Lee gets that one. It was just 12%. So he was off by 2%, but only 12% approval amongst Americans for legalization of pot. And here's a follow-up. True or false? Support for marijuana legalization has increased steadily ever since.
True.
I'm going to say false. I'm going to say that it had a little bouncing around.
Well, steadily is a funny word. Let me do a regression analysis around that and see just exactly how.
Yeah.
It's binary here, Lee. True or false?
Yeah, I'm going to go increased steadily. Yeah, I think it's increased.
So true or false? If you had to,
Oh, true.
He's saying
it's
true.
a true.
Yeah.
True.
He's saying true.
Okay. So it actually began declining in 1977 and flatlined at best throughout the Just Say No period of the 1980s.
Wow.
It took more than 20 years to reach the number 28% that it was in 1977.
Wow.
So the answer there was false.
So Barb has 3, Mary has 2, and Lee has 2.
Yeah, I kind of remembered the 3 strikes and you're out period. And so when there was this real sense that this was a gateway drug to a lot of the drug abuse that was going on. Okay, but let's fast forward to today. A 2024 Pew Research survey found that 88% of U.S. adults say marijuana should be legal, either for medical or recreational use.
And the January 2024 Marist Gen Next survey found some really interesting generational differences in support for marijuana legalization and how the drug is viewed.
Right. Even though Gen Z is super supportive of legalization, more than half of them, 53%, say marijuana is addictive or addictive and leads to other drug use. Just to note, that number was higher than millennials, Gen X, and even boomers.
It is worth remembering here that marijuana is still illegal federally. It's only been decriminalized and legalized in state law. So when we asked in our Gen X survey if people thought it should be legalized at the federal level, the results were also noteworthy.
Just 7% of Gen Z and 6% of millennials said marijuana should stay illegal in federal law, compared with 16% of Gen X and 22% of baby boomers.
Okay, so we've gone from just 12% supporting marijuana legalization in 1969 to 88% in 2024. But the key part of that story isn't just the increase, it's the long and winding road it took to get here.
Exactly, Hunter. Support didn't even hit 30% until the year 2000, over 3 decades after Woodstock. And in the interim, as we noted in our trivia game, it actually dipped for about 2 decades through the 80s and the 90s. In 2005, it was still only at 36%. So what's happened since?
Well, a few big things were happening at once. First, a lot of early polling shows that marijuana usage was deeply frowned upon, especially during the Just Say No era of the 1980s. That I remember well. That campaign, along with the general war on drugs, framed weed as a gateway drug.
And this is something we saw reflected in policies like mandatory minimums and arrests for possession. In 2010, there were over 800,000 marijuana-related arrests annually, according to data from the FBI.
So let's just step back a sec to 1996, because that was a big year when California became the first state to legalize medical marijuana. And that helped shift the narrative, especially because it brought in groups like veterans and cancer patients who are using marijuana for pain relief.
Medical use became increasingly common over the next few years, but it took another decade and a half for the big breakthrough. In 2012, Colorado and Washington both legalized recreational use. That cracked the wall.
Yep. You can actually see the shift in the data. The very next year, in 2013, Gallup showed that 58% supported legalization without the medical/recreational distinction. And by 2020, that number had jumped to 68%. This rapid change in public opinion was remarkable, to say the least.
Well, a few things here. First, demographics. During this time, boomers, dare I say the original American pot generation, was replacing rapidly their elders as the largest, most reliable block of voters.
Then, of course, there's the factor of pop culture. From comedies to the serious, marijuana use was normalized. Smoking a joint was no longer something network censors automatically banned.
And we can't forget about the money. The legal cannabis industry is now worth billions. Cannabis added approximately $115.2 billion to the economy in 2024. And cannabis tax revenue is $20 billion, nearly double that of alcohol.
So this isn't just about attitudes changing out of nowhere. It's about years of state-level action, personal stories, advocacy, cultural shifts, and yes, a very significant generational change.
Before we talk about this, here's where things stood as of March 2025. 24 states plus Washington, D.C. have fully legalized weed for both recreational and medical use. 16 states have medical marijuana programs. Only 9 states remain having not legalized it for either use.
Also, let's not forget that legalization was on the ballot in 4 states this past election. While Nebraska overwhelmingly voted to legalize, both Dakotas voted against it. And we can't forget about Florida, where the majority voted to legalize, but the measure still failed due to the 60% threshold requirement.
You know, I can't help but feel that this is a story whose ending we haven't quite seen yet. When I think about the fact that, like most things, different individuals respond differently to taking a particular substance. So with broader usage throughout the population over longer periods of time, the new ways to grow marijuana and distribute it, I think this is something that's going to be continued. I think also one thing that I found fascinating, Hunter, was the difference in generational support. And in our Gen X survey, as Mary, you pointed out too, there's a question here whether younger people are actually going to be as accepting of legalization over time as perhaps their parents are. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I find it somewhat interesting because we are the first generation that hasn't necessarily had to be a part of that big fight for legalization, if that makes sense. As, we come into these years where it would finally be in our lives, like 17, 18 years old. We're at that point where it's in New York State, it's legalized. And in almost any state in the country, you could find it in a neighboring state, you could find it in a gas station, and unfortunately it's a market that is accessible no matter where you are now, and it's not something that's necessarily that fight where you're trying to find it on the street corner. I know I've heard some crazy stories from my parents about what you guys used to have to do. So I think it's
hey, we're not pointing fingers here.
No
Okay.
fingers pointing. I mean, the generation as a whole, the difference in what you guys had to experience for it, but also the fight for it. We are coming into it more from the same perspective we have with alcohol, where it's accessible to us. We can use it at our own leisure as we please, but we are also completely responsible for the impact that it has on our lives. And that includes our health, both physical and mental health.
So, Hunter, I think that's a really good point about the accessibility of marijuana. And that immediately came to mind in reading through the script and reading through the data. I think what's really interesting is how not just your generation, but how younger generations navigate marijuana use. As you pointed out, it's much like alcohol. And so with that, will there be regulations put in place in terms of a legal age for consumption and for use? And how, parents navigate this conversation. I mean, as you pointed out, here in New York, it is legal. My kids, know the smell of marijuana. And how do you explain that to them? It's a question of, well, what's that smell? And they're like, oh, that's what it smells like. I'm like, okay, maybe that's not such a bad thing. You don't like the smell of marijuana. But it really is an open conversation. And it really has to do with, self-monitoring. As you pointed out, it has to do with health. And, you have that mind frame of the impact. Will others? We don't know. And so how far is this going to become? If it will become, it will obviously, I believe, will remain legal. But will regulations need to be put in place? I've seen advertisements where it talks about how it's illegal to drive high. And I think that that's a really big development that's occurred because it is raising awareness that even though marijuana is legal, it's not okay to drive while high.
And so, I think this has changed the narrative. I think just as medicinal marijuana changed the narrative for an earlier generation, certainly the legalization, if not federally, in most states, is going to change the narrative of the story as we go forward. And certainly, we will continue to survey and measure its acceptance and its restrictions.
We're here with Hannah Tone today, a former student producer on the Poll Hub podcast. Did you appear on the podcast ever, or were you more just behind the scenes?
I did have one podcast segment. It covered the women's wage gap following Nobel Prize from Claudia Golden. I talked with Jay and Mary about women in the workforce and the rise of men staying at home. And we had a guest, Dr. Kristen Bayer, who is the chair of the Women's Studies program at Marist.
We're here today with Kenneth Marples. What exactly did your duties consist of on the podcast?
They called me the guinea pig. So they didn't it was like the guinea pig. So I was like the first one to have this sort of role. So it was sort of like a jack of all trades kind of thing.
I know now you're doing producing. If you go and expand a little bit more on that.
Yeah, so I'm an associate producer at Fox Business, which was the Claiming Countdown. So right when all the craziness happens with the last hour of trading at the stock markets, I'm the one who basically talks to major CEOs about stocks.
Who's ready for some more trivia questions?
Yeah, absolutely. We've been humiliated thus far.
Okay. In this segment, let's go all the way back to the 1930s to understand how Americans viewed foreign trade over 80 years ago. In 1939, Roper asked Americans whether they considered foreign trade essential for prosperity or merely beneficial. What percentage believed it was a necessity for American prosperity?
I'm going to go with 25%.
I'm going with 14%.
I'm going to go with 36%.
And the answer is 47% of respondents felt it was a necessity.
Wow.
27%
Wow,
said it helped,
interesting.
and 18% said we could get along without it. So the point goes to Mary, I think.
Yeah.
All right. Absolutely.
Is there a prize at the end of this? Because then I'll really start concentrating.
Yeah, it's called bragging rights, Lee.
Bragging rights is probably the most important thing in life, yes.
The sentiment in favor of trade reflected what had happened over the prior decade as trade in the Great Depression became intermixed. In 1930, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act raised import duties, otherwise known as tariffs, in an effort to protect American farmers. As a result, many countries around the world added or raised their own retaliatory tariffs.
Sounds kind of familiar, huh? Well, Smoot-Hawley originated from mounting pressure back in the 20s by American agricultural interests. They were seeking protection from falling prices and growing foreign competition. But while it initially focused just on agriculture, lobbying from other industries quickly broadened the scope.
In the wake of the 1929 stock market crash, protectionist sentiment grew, and despite strong opposition from economists, President Hoover signed the bill into law in 1930, significantly hiking tariffs and marking a shift toward American economic isolationism.
And this led to a decline in international trade and, many economists say, deepened the Great Depression. Following World War II, the U.S. generally tried to promote trade by lowering tariffs and moving towards a world economy based on free trade.
And that went on for a long time. The next time foreign trade was really a big issue for Americans was decades later, in the late 80s and early 90s. You may remember presidential candidate Ross Perot got nearly 19% of the vote in 1992, running on a platform to reverse some free trade policies he said had created a giant sucking sound, I will not try and do the accent, of jobs leaving the U.S.
So here's the next question, and it comes from a 1994 Gallup poll. Is foreign trade more of an opportunity or a threat?
What was this? What year?
1994.
So it is an opportunity. 56%. 56%.
I'm going to say 42.
Lee, you said 56%?
I can change it if you like.
I'm gonna go with 52%.
The answer is 53%, so Mary gets a point.
Wow. Nice.
Mary, can we go? Can I take you to Yonkers racetrack? I'd like to make it.
Just have her buy you some scratch offs.
No, actually, yeah, I was about to say.
I'm not lucky.
She's about to pick some numbers for the lottery.
Hardly.
In the 90s, many Americans had a critical view of foreign trade due to concerns about job losses, especially in manufacturing. The implementation of trade agreements like the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, led to fears that companies would move production to countries with lower labor costs, resulting in factory closures and unemployment in the U.S.
Additionally, a growing trade deficit and the outsourcing of jobs contributed to the perception that foreign trade benefited corporations more than workers. These ideas about economic nationalism never really went away because the issues surrounding NAFTA were never really resolved. And all of this happened before China began ramping up to become the world's quote-unquote manufacturing superpower.
And what's really interesting here is that while free trade had been a mainstay of Republican politics, at least since the 1940s, and a somewhat divisive issue for Democrats, certainly since the 80s, it has always been anathema to Donald Trump. So when he was elected in 2016, tariffs re-entered the political discussion for the first time in decades. But the tariffs he put in place during his first term, they actually turned out to really only be an appetizer.
Okay, so once again, trade is a big issue as it's one of Donald Trump's main obsessions. So let's bring this all the way back to February of this year when Gallup polled on this again. What percentage of respondents do you think viewed foreign trade as an opportunity?
62%.
I will say 78.
I'm going to go with 71.
So the answer is 81%, and just 14 saw it as a threat. So that means Barb gets the point.
So that means Mary has 4, Barb has 4, and Lee has 2.
Trump has always been a fan of tariffs, talking about them back in the 1980s. He's also said that tariffs could have salvaged the economy in the Great Depression, which is more than a little ironic since many economists say his actions are very similar to Smoot-Hawley, which, as you'll recall, most economists say actually deepened the Depression.
Well, his recent Liberation Day tariffs were ostensibly designed to reduce the trade deficit, to protect U.S. industries, to bring companies back, to pressure countries like China to change what he claims are unfair trade practices. So while Trump frames tariffs as a tax paid by other countries, nearly all economists say they're almost always paid for by, in this case, American consumers through higher prices on imported goods. And we import a lot of goods nowadays.
In addition, this time around, his tariffs tanked the stock market, strained international relationships, and triggered retaliatory actions that have hurt American exporters, especially farmers.
And while the long-term effects of President Trump's tariff policy are yet to be seen, he's been announcing deals and rolling back some of the tariffs. Still, these post-Liberation Day deals have, for the most part, left much higher tariffs in place than when he took office. So let's open up the discussion now. What role do you think, Jay, public opinion plays in shaping trade policy, and do you think it can have any influence in future decisions down the road?
So much of this has to do with politics and the politics of things that aren't directly related, or they are directly related to trade, but people don't think of them as trade. So jobs, and the economy in general. And I think that's the challenge here is that if you look at tariffs or you look at trade policy in isolation, it's almost like looking at foreign policy. We see this in our polling. Foreign policy is almost never the top issue for voters. The economy generally is, but there can be other things. And I think that in this case, trade is never a top issue for voters. Even Ross Perot got 90% of the vote. He didn't win.
Yeah.
Right? So I think it's a piece of a bigger puzzle. And when it is something that can be used to, especially as a political kind of weapon, to paint another party as failing on the economy, I think that's where it gains traction. And I think that's where politicians and kind of more importantly, in this case, voters actually begin to pay attention.
Yeah, and this is your segment that you produced and it was great. Just wondering, do you think that the sort of enigma behind tariffs played into Americans' public perception? I mean, it's really not an easy concept to grasp. As there's been more focus on it and greater discussion, I think that more people are becoming familiar with exactly what they are. But how much do you think that played into the discussion?
Yeah, I think this idea of tariffs as a political tool and the way that Trump was able to utilize them to further paint the Democratic Party as this poor economic figure. And he was able to sort of play on the fact that a lot of Americans don't have a great understanding of what tariffs are and what they do. And I think, a part of that maybe is because tariffs haven't been this huge political discussion in recent history compared to maybe further down in American history. That's why in the 30s, after they had a large tariff enacted and then that backfired, we saw a long stretch of public opinion where foreign trade was looked at in a positive light. But then I think eventually Americans kind of forget certain historical events, and it takes actual policy for Americans to realize what certain things will do and how it will affect the economy.
Yeah, I think there's actually there's a real truth in there about tariffs. And right now, our polling has shown, and other people's polling has shown, that tariffs actually are one of the least popular parts of Donald Trump's agenda. And while even among Republicans, I mean, there's a majority support in most of the polls that we've been looking at, but it's the smallest thing. It's the thing that the Republicans are least happy with him about. I wonder though, Mary, if it comes, like AJ just suggested, it only becomes an issue and people pay attention and begin to understand it when it begins to affect them. If Walmart is raising prices, if Amazon is not able to deliver what you're looking for, or there's a surcharge, if car prices are impossibly high, is that the kind of trigger that causes people to say, oh, that's what tariffs are?
Absolutely. I think there's 100% truth in that people really start paying attention to what affects them. And there's no getting around that. I mean, you go to the grocery store, you see prices going up. You want to make a large purchase, but you need to postpone it because the price is just astronomical due to tariffs. It becomes a matter of day-to-day living. And so the more prevalent that becomes, the greater the issue and the greater importance it is in the mind of the general public.
And I think it's interesting that the economy was one of the most defining factors that people seem to vote on consistently. It was one of the biggest issues that pushed people to vote for Trump. And yet, tariffs are a huge part of his economic plan, but they're also unpopular. So it's an interesting contrast in a way between
Well, they're also, I mean, AJ,
his platform.
they're also what's driving down his approval numbers on the economy as
Right.
well. It's all kind of part
Yeah.
and parcel of the same thing. I wonder in your case, like, so tariffs aren't something that anybody your age would have ever heard of. I mean, you don't even study them in school. When it kind of popped up and this all happened, what made you think, wow, this is a segment I want to do? I mean, what tariffs must have seemed like something out of like a science fiction movie.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting the way, like, as Trump was rolling out his plan for it, like, I found it interesting because I had never seen anything like that. Like, generally, I follow politics, and I like the way he was like unveiling everything. I was like, this is crazy. And also, I had such a limited knowledge of it. I think most Americans my age do have a limited understanding of the economy and how it works and about things like tariffs. So that was another reason why I wanted to do it, was to like understand it better. So I think it was a combination of things.
So given the impact and what President Trump has done, at what point, if at any, do Republicans flip the switch in terms of policy?
Yeah, what's so interesting about tariffs is that the president is setting these tariffs under an emergency action that the Congress could take away, like tomorrow, today, if they wanted to.
Right.
And so this is really all on the Republicans in Congress if they don't want to do this. I think it'll come down to the point in time, and that's the much bigger meta question. It comes down to the point in time, if it ever comes, where Republicans see their chances of winning re-election in the next election, 2026, as diminishing because of some of the things that Donald Trump are doing, specifically tariffs. Tariffs seems to be a very specific, very unpopular thing that is driving the one issue most voters care most about, which is the economy. And if there is going to be a point where Republicans flip the switch, it's going to have to be a point where they fear losing elections in 2026 more than they fear Donald Trump. We haven't seen that happen in the years that Donald Trump's been on the scene. But I think that's the point, if it comes, where Congress may regain control of that economic policy lever of tariffs.
All right, I'm here with Rebecca Hendricks, former student producer of the Marist Poll Hub podcast. What is your favorite Poll Hub memory?
My favorite Poll Hub memory, I loved the fun facts, and I loved finding out what every single host thought about Jell-O and how much Athen Hollis loved it.
We are here with Delaney Hayes. What skill did you gain from working on the podcast that you felt was most applicable to your profession?
So I would say that the skill that is most applicable to my profession that I learned right now is when we were creating podcast segments and we would reach out to experts in their respective fields and conducting the interviews by ourselves. Sometimes I think that the skill of being able to talk with someone and ask them questions about what they're doing is really important. And I find that now in law school, when I am networking with fellow alums about, where they work and where I might potentially want to work, I think that the skill of being able to converse with someone in a very professional setting and gain information from them that you need is really important and beneficial.
All right, we are here with the infamous Athen Hollis. What is your favorite Poll Hub memory?
Oh, where to start? There's too many. I heard from a little bird that someone has already mentioned the Jell-O memory, but I'll say it again. I think those were my favorite segments, and especially when Jay brought me Jell-O, the multiple times he's done it. I also think any of the segments that were super duper weird that Jay let me research. In particular, I had an entire segment about aliens that he let me research, and I had an entire segment about the different groundhogs on Groundhog's Day that he was resistant to, but let me research anyway.
So before we let Lee get to our Poll Hub 400 fun fact, how about one last trivia question, and then we'll tally the results.
And this one, for a twist, is worth 3 points. So Lee, even you can come from behind and win this one. Here we go. In what year did the New York Times first write about the Marist Poll?
This is rigged.
Oh, okay. I think it was August 29th, 1982.
Wow.
That's concerningly specific in my opinion.
And Barb stole my year. I was going to say 1982, so I can't say that. So I'm going to go with 1984.
Wow.
Lee,
this is
you are
hard.
the director of the Institute. What say you?
I'm going to say 1985. I actually remember it, I think. But I'm going to go 1985.
It was 1984.
That's got to put you over the top.
And the interesting thing about it is, it was in an opinion piece that
By Sapphire.
No, it was in a section called Topics at the bottom of the op-ed page, and it was an unsigned report about how polls shouldn't use decimal points, shouldn't report decimal points.
that was William
by
Sapphire.
William Sapphire. It was called the
Yes.
needless decimal point.
And so that's the first reference of the Marist Poll in the Times. Later that year, in the run-up to the New York primary, in the Democratic primary in 1984, there is a reference to our poll of who would win the New York presidential primary. And so those are the two first references in the Times, are both from 1984.
That's interesting and the reason why I was specific is because August 29th is my birthday. And I thought it was a reference that Franklin, who wrote for the Times, had made to one of our polls regarding the New York governor's race. And I couldn't decide whether it was that one or the Sapphire piece, which ultimately is the one that you guys found in 84.
You should have known there wasn't a governor's race in
1982.
Oh, you said 82. Okay.
Yeah, I said 82.
But we both remembered, not that we're thin-skinned, we both remembered that it was called the needless decimal.
So I think because I was going to say 1982, I just call it a wash and no one gets the points.
Oh,
no.
please, Mary.
Come on,
No,
3
you've
points.
got bragging rights. Oh, come on, Mary.
Or since Lee would be the closest to 84, since I had said 82, give Lee the points.
Definitely not, Mary. Are you out of your mind? We wouldn't live it down. Congratulations, Mary. You are clearly the most insightful pollster at the Marist
Applause
Institute.
all around.
Wow.
And what do you win? You win another 100 episodes of Poll Hub.
That's what I wanted.
Well, I must say these were very original.
Congratulations.
Wow. And if this episode, our 400th, hasn't been fun enough, and it certainly has been, here is a list of some of different kinds of famous people. Which one or two of those famous types would you most like to be? This was done by the Roper Poll in 1987. And leading the pack were things like popular singer 15 and author of best-selling books 15 and a pianist, trumpet player, or violinist, etc. at 14. And it goes down, things like a businessman, an artist, an actor, a famous scientist, lots and lots of choices. So why don't we see what our esteemed panel would prefer to be, where they have one of those categories of famous people. And I know what Barb's is. Go ahead, Barb.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I think there are a lot of professions that we currently do think about that were not even in the mind's eye in 1987. But there's one there that seems to go across generations. And I often say I would have loved to have been a rock and roll singer or a lead singer for a rock and roll band.
Like Pat Benatar or...
Yeah.
Oh, I love Pat Benatar.
I mean, who's your
Yes,
role
we
model?
will-
Who's like your role
Let's
model
see,
rock
who's
and roll
my
singer?
role model? Who's my role model rock and roll singer? I think just
Paul
about
McCartney.
Paul McCartney.
Paul McCartney.
Paul McCartney has not transitioned to his female self, so I think we're going to go with,
I would say probably Natalie Merchant of 10,000 Maniacs.
Very good.
Love her too.
Well, Mary, I'm going to go to you next and bring some, more contemporary insight into this. What would you go for?
In 1987, I would have gone for a rock singer too. I mean, that's what it was all about, hair bands and all that good stuff. Yes, I like my rock, but I'm a little surprised that model isn't on there. Maybe that was a little bit later in the 1990s when it was the Cindy Crawford type, era. And that's when I was growing up, and a lot of my friends wanted to be models when they grew up. So
Okay.
None of them did, I don't think. So,
All right, turning it over to Jay Dapper, closer to my generation, Jay.
So, look, pianist, trumpet player, violinist is the third answer in 1987. That's what I just, I'm like, wow.
Oh.
This is an open-end
Well, wait a
question.
second.
This is a
Wait a
face-to-face
second.
interview. These were face-to-face interviews in 1987, which is rather remarkable.
Well, wait a second. Weren't there some big pianists though in the 80s? Like was Barry Manilow a
He's
pianist?
60s and 70s, and he was a
yeah,
singer.
no.
He wasn't. No.
Oh, okay. But
when did Yo-Yo Ma become?
Well, he's a celloist, which is somewhat like.
But along those lines.
But folks, my point is.
We're doing really well right now.
My point is.
We're moving on right now to the younger generation.
Well, wait a second. Wait. How about Kenny G?
He plays a
Right? He plays a
clarinet,
clarinet?
a soprano clarinet. My point is that it's the third highest answer. Even if you're into soft jazz, how is that beating sports star? How is that beating actress? That beats being a Hollywood star.
Yeah.
I don't get it. Anyway, my pick on this, I would love to say I'd want to be an author of a best-selling book because it makes me, sound sophisticated and smart, but that's not the answer. I would actually most want to be an astronaut because I would love to go to space.
Oh,
An
well, it's not too late.
It's not too late.
It's not too late.
Yeah, if I only had
not too
a
late.
$1 million or whatever it costs to get on either Elon Musk's or Jeff Bezos's rocket, I could do that. So give me a raise, guys.
We're going to go right now to the youngers, our younger generation of student pollsters, student producers. Neil, why don't you start off?
So when I first looked at this, I was a little confused because the letters, it's labeled by letter on the side. So it says a sports star and a team sport. I thought that said an LA sports star. And I thought they were talking.
You want to be Kobe, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I thought they were talking about like Magic Johnson, the Showtime Lakers. But I think I would choose a famous journalist or newscaster. I feel like because I am a journalism major and getting into journalism is a little rough right now. But I feel like the environment had to be a little bit better at least back in the late 80s. And I feel like there's a lot of cool things to report on then.
There still are.
There are, but I feel like this was a better time for journalism before, like when broadcast was well established, but the digital age didn't really exactly take over yet.
Fair enough.
Okay. Well, I think it's very noble.
Thank you.
And Mr. Hunter, what do you got?
I don't think I like the Mr. Hunter, and it's gonna go well with my choice, I'm sure. So and this should not surprise anybody, but I'm gonna obviously go with 7%. That said, a high-ranking government official like mayor, governor, senator, cabinet officer, etc. More
Not
specifically,
president. Not president.
It's not
No,
listed.
So I don't think I want to be president, but if anyone offered me Secretary of State, I would take that, in a heartbeat any day.
I
of the
thought you
week.
would take Secretary of Transportation, giving your pension for flying around the world.
Yeah, but Secretary of State
I
flies.
figured the state is easier. Yeah.
State, you fly around the
Secretary
world.
Petro.
Secretary of Transportation, you have to explain why the air traffic control system's breaking down. Not as fun.
Yeah, and can't put that on me.
Yeah, AJ, this is, I believe, your category. Did you select this
No,
one?
I selected
Yeah,
it.
Who
yeah,
selected it?
I would say
Okay.
TV actor, which is like 5% of respondents miss, but I would choose that over movie because I feel like it's like more stability to it. You get the recurring role.
Oh, that's so smart.
And what type of genre would you want that TV show to be?
Maybe like a soap opera, so it's like 20 seasons and I just keep getting paid.
But they could kill you off. They could
could.
kill you
You gotta
off.
watch that. You gotta watch that. That and hospital programs are very dangerous on your level.
I love that, though, because most of the time if somebody says they want to be an actor and a star, it's like, I just want to be big. I want to be famous. And AJ is like,
Well,
so practical. I want
he
to
wants
have
a
a
long-term
job for
contract.
20 years and get residuals.
Yes.
I mean, that's amazing.
Anybody
Very
who knows-
entertaining. And was there? And so AJ, what attracted you to this question?
I just thought it was the responses were so interesting. When I saw pianist and like author in the top three, I was interested, and then like acting was at the bottom, and then there was like scientist and astronaut above it. So I was just like, that's such an interesting responses for the late 80s.
It is really, it is up. It's very upside down, I think. I mean, you'd think that.
And anybody who knows me,
you know what yours. You haven't told us what you would be, so go ahead.
Yeah, I'm in the 14%. I mean, I still hold out hopes to be center fielder for the Yankees. Although hitting's pretty good this year, but the pitching, my arm's a little, I'll probably throw up to 50 miles
but
an hour.
You're not a pitcher. You're in center field, so you can throw. Yeah,
that's why I'm going
hit
to
the plate.
Field.
You can hit the plate from the
Just
wall
get a good
with your arm, right?
I need a cutoff man standing somewhere halfway between second base and the outfield. That'd be my cutoff man. Given the success of, I think, the three of you students putting this together for our 400th, I surely hope that you participate in our 500th, which of course will be in about 2 years, if I can count right. I'm going to point out that, and this is maybe a little bit of a play to the audience, but the thing I would like to be when I grow up is exactly what I'm doing, and that is working with students at Marist University conducting public opinion polls.
Well, then you are one of the luckiest people on earth, right?
It's been a while. And that wraps up, I believe, this 400 segment, and we hope you enjoyed it, and see you next week or after another 100 segments.
Yeah, maybe we take a week off. Before we go, just thanks to all of the students that we heard from who've worked with us in the past, and thanks to you guys, obviously, that are currently working with us. Just so the audience knows, we used to do this podcast, Mary, me, Lee, and Barb. It was largely us, and students had some peripheral involvement. We show up now, and we talk. These guys do most all of the work. So big changes over 7 years, and thank you so much to all the students who have made this possible and successful.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Neil Viswanathan, Hunter Petro,
AJ Cambino, Tommy Rogers, and Cassidy Connors.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal accessible from our website.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.